October 17th, 1974. I'm interviewing Rabbi Lorge in Chicago, Illinois.
Dates. Working? Yeah. The dates I'm mentioning are approximate. I will try to ascertain from a diary that somehow or other I've misplaced, which I will send forward to get the more exact dates. The time of operation that we are talking about is roughly from May 44 to March or April 40, right? May 45, I'm wrong. Excuse me, May 45 to March 46 when I returned to the United States, a little less than a year. The area of operation is one, Saxony, an area east of Leipzig and north up to Torgau. Our division was the first one to link up with the Russians, and I was probably the first chaplains to meet displaced persons that came from Russian-occupied area to the western area. These were people that either survived Auschwitz, most of them did, and made their way around that time, May or June, to the border at the Elbe and came across a bridgehead or some with a boat, and then I met these people. These were first smaller groups, and then more and more came, and then camps were established. So most of the DPs I talked to were these people that drifted in from Auschwitz survivors, and also some survivors of people who had secretly hidden, either with peasants in Poland, or there were also a few, I made also a few fighters of the underground that had hidden in the woods. Most of them were women, for some reason or other. There were quite a few men, but I would say 4/5 were women. A few children. I will again refer to one group of children, approximately 30. These were almost the only children I ever met, and children in this case means youth of the ages between 14 and 17 on the outset, mostly 15-year-old. It seems to me, if I remember correctly, that even in that case, most of them were girls, and either no or just one or two boys. That was the first area, the area of within the triangle of Leipzig, Torgau on the Elbe, and a little town named Grimma, which I remember very well because there was a hospital there that I very often visited and tried to help. Then, according to the Yalta Agreement, our division moved further west. Headquarters in those days was in Rothenburg, which is not Rothenburg ob der Tauber, but a small Rothenburg near Kassel. I very soon transferred from the 69th Infantry Division, where I was one of the division chaplains, to the 3rd Division, because the 69th was deactivated. The 3rd Division was in that same area. The headquarters was in Bad Wildungen. And my area of activities, which then very soon became almost exclusively DP, because the Jewish soldiers weren't interested at that time in services. They were interested in getting home and helping DPs themselves. So it was, as far as the Jewish soldiers were concerned, I organized them to help me as much as possible. The area of that activity while I was in Bad Wildungen was Wildungen, Kassel, Marburg, and particularly Eschwege, which had a large population both in a middle-sized camp and also in the town. By that time, you had really two types of DP communities: the one that stayed in camps and the one that already settled in individual homes that usually military government had emptied of Nazis and put at the disposal of the DSPs. They usually then lived almost in a commune type thing. 2, 3, 4, 5 people, sometimes even more. There were smaller towns where there was one village where Hungarian Jewish women stayed in about 3 houses, and between them and those 3 houses they must have had 30 women. At the moment I don't remember the name of that little village. But this was a situation. Now as to specific activities, first in the area of Saxony and the Elbe River, incidentally, for about 1 week I crossed a smaller river that was also the borderline between the Russian and American zones, and I went into the Russian zone where there was also a small camp, and I helped there. I brought them primarily, but they were really undernourished, and I collected what we called dog biscuits, which was really the crackers that were part of the K rations which the soldiers were tired of eating. They threw them away, and I got a whole jeep load of those and brought them there to feed them. The first time I came over there, I had the Jewish chaplain flag flying, and within about 2 minutes it was in shreds because every DP wanted a piece of the flag. I conducted a service, and when I pronounced the Kaddish, there was such a hysterical crying that it almost sounded eerie, and coming from everybody cried, and it was these women were hysterical.
You don't remember when this was?
I don't remember when it was again. It must have been in May or early June.
Mm-hmm.
Early June possible. Sounds like me, somehow that seems to tie up with Shavuos. I think it may have been a Erev Shavuos service or something.
Mm-hmm.
I have to check. This would be in my diary.
Yeah, okay.
But I went to that particular camp in a Russian zone once more, and the third time I attempted to go over there, the barricades was closed and a Russian soldier pointed a bayonet in my direction. I asked to speak to his officer. He couldn't understand much. Some interpreter came. To make the long story short, the Iron Curtain was down and fast.
How did you know about this camp to begin with?
Through military government and rumors flying very fast. I was trying to tell you this because this is a thing that is an interesting sidelight. Everybody among the DPs knew about everybody. They traveled back and forth and brought knowledge, and probably having been so long without benefit of paper, writing, reading, or print, everything was in their memory. They had a calendar in a memory, Jewish calendar. They knew when the holidays fell. Many of them would not eat bread during Passover. Many of them, these are stories they told me, and they were told so often that they must have been true. Before Passover came, would give some of their starvation rations to the non-Jewish concentration camp people that were near them, with the promise that on Passover they would get from them some potatoes or vegetables, that they wouldn't have to eat that one piece of bread that they get. They would give it back to the others so they could exchange. But they knew when Passover was. One of these services fell on Rosh Chodesh, and I had, honestly speaking, not been aware of it, and they told me that nobody had a luach. That was all in their minds. And so they kept in their mind who was killed and who lived. The very first contact were 4 girls that had come across the river. I get a call from military government. There are 4 girls in a marketplace. They are obviously Jewish. One girl is in a complete state of shock. She doesn't speak. She just has glassy eyes. Would I come over? And I asked the other 3 girls in Yiddish and German. They all had by that time learned. Their Yiddish had become almost total German, and I, having been born and raised in Germany, that was usually the language of communication. My bad Germanized Yiddish or their bad Yiddishized German. Between the two, we were getting along very well. They told me that just as they came over, they met someone who had been in Buchenwald, and she had then been informed that one of the last people shot in Buchenwald as the Allies came in was her husband. She had known all along that her husband was alive. You wonder how. I never found out how, but somehow there was an underground. And I was telling you that, for example, they always wanted me, these various groups, various little camps, and they always, chaplain, you have to come. They wanted me. And I mentioned one reason was a question of security, because very soon they were engaged in black market activities, and officially it was prohibited, and the MPs did their duty, and then every other day 1, 2, 3, 10 were thrown into jail, and from our point of view, anything they did was legal. From our point, I mean the Jewish chaplain's point of view, anything they did was legal because of their suffering, and so we had to bail them out, and usually the military were very sympathetic. And I came to the MPs, this was all the story, you know this guy, you know this woman, she is not a Nazi, no. Well, they were black market, let's forget about it. So they knew that we would get them out of jail practically every time. And so they wanted us to be always close, but it was more than that. It was really to have a bridge to the free world, to see an officer's uniform with the Morgan David and the tablets of which we had, our insignia, was a tremendous thing, just like the chaplain's flag was a great thing. It was a morale builder. So it was always like this. You must come tomorrow. We have a birthday celebration. They, of course, didn't have celebrations in God knows how many years. So now any excuse. The celebrations meant that they got some rations of flour and sugar, and they made a little cake and maybe some black market coffee. Everything was black market anyhow. And I had to be there. So very often I said, no, I already promised to be with another group. Suddenly someone is in jail in his third place, and I have to go somewhere else altogether. And the next day a delegation came. You weren't in this other group. You told us, so you could have come to us. And they kept track of me. They kept track. They were the ones who told me when it was time to leave for the western area, when we would leave that Saxony area, I heard it first from the DPs. This was a secret. There were rumors, but the date was certainly a secret, but they knew the date. I don't know which officer spoke, but it must have been on a filtered down from a very high level, because I talked to many of my good friends in middle ranks, majors, lieutenant colonels, had no idea what was happening. I thought they were wrong, but they happened to be right. They had a tremendous access to knowledge that we didn't have, and they knew where I was at all the time, and they knew, because what happened to their kin and all of this. I talked about the attitude to Russia and the Russian military. The only thing they wanted was get out. I'm talking about 99%. I might say this, that I asked them how the Russians treated them, and the reports were contradictory. I think piecing it together, I would say that it depended what sort of Russian unit liberated them. I can imagine, I know that the city units, like, I found out that one unit drove out all the Germans and installed the DPs in that area. This was further in Czechoslovakia somewhere. They told me that, several people told me that, and they made the Germans to wait on the DPs to clean their rooms and to cook for them. And they really treated them even better than the Americans would treat them. And then other units treated them not much better than the Nazis, including there were rapes, and then all this. Some Russian soldiers raped our Jewish women at that time. And I think that the Moscow and Leningrad units were, but this is, I think that's my impression, were civilized and very kind, and that some of the rural areas, I would guess from Ukraine and so on, were really mistreating them. But there were consistent reports of both types of things, which I think it probably points that it's historically correct that their treatment was varied greatly depending on where it was. But irrespective, even those that had told me, many made a point, we have nothing against the Russians, they liberated us and they were fairly decent to us, but we don't want to live under dictatorship anymore. We want to go to America, we want to go to Palestine. The Russians won't let us. And they were frantic to get out of this eastern area once we were getting out. The agreement between Russians and the Allies, the Western Allies, was that DPs could choose where they wanted to go. The transportation would be provided except for those that were not ambulatory, that were in hospitals or otherwise invalided. I think our own people didn't want to be bothered with them. So two problems arose. Number one, the transportation given for those who wanted to go to the West was assigned to nationalities, Poles, French, Dutch. Many of them had their own camps. We had Jewish camps too. At first, our Jews were assigned to the camps of their nationalities, and very, very soon it became clear that this was terrible, because anti-Semitism was rife certainly among the Eastern DPs. Of course, the few surviving Dutch girls that I saw were very happy with the Dutch. They were at the side of the Dutch freed prisoners, and the same for the French. But the Eastern people could not get along. After the terrible anti-Nazi experience, they had learned absolutely nothing. And so we got them their own camps. But when it came to transportation, they again assigned it to the nationalities, and the Jews were expected to ride in the Polish trains, which they absolutely had to refuse to do. And it took me about 2 days working through military and German railroad authorities to finally get one very large train out of Leipzig for all Jewish DPs. The moment that was done, I had another problem with the people who were in the hospital in Grimma, who wanted, also they were threatened, and I think many of them were serious of wanting to commit suicide rather than go under the Russian administration again. And I asked the Jewish major of the ordnance company to let me have 2 trucks to get...
Remember his name?
I think it was Major Walcher, W-A-L-S-C-H-E-R. I've never had contact with him again. Some of the officers I'm still in contact with. He sent 2 trucks with Gentile drivers. All of this was, from the Army point of view, illegal. Everything we chaplains did was illegal. First of all, we were supposed to deal with Jewish soldiers and not with DPs. And once this thing broke, the whole religious work of the chaplain, religious quote unquote, meaning conducting service and so with American soldiers, it was almost meaningless. We weren't even interested in this anymore. This was understood by most commanding officers. I think there's 1 or 2 chaplains that give the impression that they were under constant threat of court-martial. They may or may not have been. I personally have found that there was a great deal of understanding at that time among American commanders, and I have a feeling that all that was necessary is to try to tell them where you were roaming around and let them feel that somehow or other they're still your commanders. I'm wondering, and I don't want to cast any suspicion upon other chaplains, but I think some chaplains became so independent that they unnecessarily antagonized their commanding officer. There's a story that one chaplain was threatened with court-martial or papers. I don't think...
Who are you talking about?
Well, off the record, Klausner.
Yeah.
I think Klausner was abrasive. He did a tremendous job. I don't take anything away. But I think he could have done the same job without antagonizing half of the army in Bavaria, because the others worked with their commanding officers. First of all, the whole story of a court-martial is a very unlikely thing for a chaplain because it creates bad publicity, and they have a much better way. If they really want to get a chaplain out, they ask the Jewish Welfare Board to withdraw their endorsement. You can't be a Jewish chaplain unless you're endorsed by the Welfare Board. No chaplain that I know was ever court-martialed. Very recently there was something like that in the Navy where there was a chaplain under suspicion of having raped one of his cases or having committed adultery with one of his... But it would have to be something like that for inefficiency or for not obeying the command of an officer. If it got that bad, they would have asked that their endorsement would have... That's an aside. I would say that most of the Army brass was sympathetic to what we were doing. But when a major of the ordnance diverts 2 trucks for one day to transport sick people into an area where we had no business at all, a different army area, we couldn't. Of course, my preference would have been to take them where we were about to go, take them somewhere to Kassel, but this was further. We simply went south into Bavaria, and I didn't know much about it. I looked for army hospitals. The first one I was refused, and the second one, in the middle of a field, finally accepted these, imagine, also about 30 people. And this was, of course, 5th Army area under Patton, where rules were pretty strict, and he was not very sympathetic. But what I wanted to say was that these Gentile people that cooperated with us certainly endangered themselves a little more than we did. Not that they would have been anything too serious, but they could have be reduced in rank, because these drivers and the major did 2 wrong things. They diverted army trucks for non-army business. And he went into an area that we were not supposed to go to, contrary to the strict rules that hospital patients should not be moved at all, but he kept to the Russians. So some of these people have really been very fine, and there were many, many Gentile soldiers and officers that helped us in this thing. Okay, this was a transportation west, and when we got west, I helped organize a little bit of community in Marburg. For a while we got out a DP paper, helped them getting it printed. These people lived all in individual homes. This was not a camp.
Remember the name of the paper?
Was it Unser Weg, or was it...
Unser Weg
was it Rundschau? No, was it Rundschau or something? I may even find drum up a copy of it if I look. If I send you the stuff, you have to send it back to me.
Yeah. Perhaps you would like to have it Xerox then.
Yeah, maybe I'll do that in some instances, see what we can do. We got out a paper, and this whole thing was organized on a model of a little kehillah.
What was your role in this?
The role was as advisor and getting material support for military government, printing and so on, and mostly liaison between them and military government. The military government was not bad and wasn't good. They were very neutral on that. They were sometimes annoyed by the chutzpah of these people because they felt they had nothing to lose. And they weren't even, in some kinds of cases, even respectful. Most of the military government people were sympathetic. But this too is an interesting thing. This has been written up very, very often. This changed. At the beginning, in May, June, all through the fall, the sky was a limit as far as helping DPs was concerned. They knew what they had gone through and so on. By that time, fraternization with the Germans started, and the German Fräuleins, and in the government offices you had German secretaries. And to be very honest, the Germans were very careful not to show pro-Nazi sympathies, and some were cleared, and some really were anti-Nazis. And some would have helped our people on their terms. Their terms were, yes, sir, no, sir, because they were already in the office. The Germans, again, wanted to be treated like the bosses, even the anti-Nazis. And when they came in, and they really were still, of course, tremendously angry at the Germans, and they told us they talked to the secretaries and all in terms that were anything but respectful. None of us would have. They didn't say please or good morning. I'll say, I want to say Major so-and-so. Tell Major so-and-so I'm here. It was all command, and they really hated to talk to them altogether. So then already more and more the sympathy evaporated. And we had to do a lot of explaining to do, and always to remind them, look what they went through, and of course they really should get psychiatric treatment. It's not available. And what we have said is almost anything is excusable in this case. So whatever they needed, we had to get. Because you couldn't get anything, the stores still weren't open in many of these cases. There were all sorts of shortages. There was paper shortages, print, whatever there was, we had to get through military government. They had control of everything. So this was our help there. I'm just remembering the man was very active both in Eschwege, and his friend, that I think doesn't even live anymore, was very active in Marburg. He's now a very orthodox man, and he lives in San Antonio, Texas. You might try to get in touch with him. His name is Sam. His sister changed from later, came out to look over. I think it's Sam, wait a minute, no. I'm going to send you that address. Okay. I'm going to send you that. I have that at home. I exchange Rosh Hashanah greetings with him. He was very active in this type of work. He was a little bit of an organizer of the DPs. He was very close to me, and he was really the liaison man for in that area, not in the area of Kassel and Eschwege. Eschwege was a camp, was very soon taken over by UNRWA. And JDC workers loaned to UNRWA came in. By that time, the JDC really was active. They came in a little delayed.
What are we talking about?
Now we're talking about the fall and winter of 45. Late fall and winter. By that time, JDC had activated, and there was some sort of an agreement between JDC and UNRWA, UNRRA. There was a French worker there, Miss Bloch, who did a lot of work. I've lost contact with her. She was in charge of that area. Being JDC, she had a JDC uniform that was attached to UNRWA. And that was Eschwege. There was a community in Kassel that I visited. And
do you remember experiences in Kassel?
They were mostly also in homes, and we conducted services. We got some books for the children, one or two children that they found, youngsters. So this is a picture about the picture of the work that was done. The last period, about February, it's January, February. In February, I went to Heidelberg. Was transferred from the 3rd Army, from the 3rd Division in Bad Wildungen to the 7th Army headquarters, replacing a chaplain Braudy, colonel who went to Constabulary. So I was a chap. No, I think this one went back to the States and was teaching at the chaplain school.
You're talking about Max Braudy?
No. Maybe it was Max Brody.
Brody.
Brody. Wait a minute. There was one
Arthur
Brody.
Brody?
He had been with the 7th Army headquarters.
Yeah.
And then he was sometime at a chaplain school. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was at a high rank. Max Brody, I think, is another one. Wait a minute. I've forgotten whether it's Max or Arthur. One was Brody, one was Brody.
Yeah.
This was the one who was the 7th Army, and I replaced him for about 2 months, and then I got home.
Browdy was in
Heidelberg. This was in Heidelberg.
He was in the 7th Army.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
that's him.
Yeah.
I replaced him as a at headquarters 7th Army. I'm wrong when I said what I say. I must have been there at Patton's funeral. You just saw that letter. That's what when I was as a 7th Army chaplain, I organized the funeral for Patton.
Uh-huh.
I didn't organize the death, but the funeral. And so I must have started in Heidelberg already in December. Every day something else happened. I did nothing else. We worked 7 days. So that things that now seem like they were months must have happened in 2-3 weeks, because I ran from one place to another and so on. In Heidelberg, things were very, very well organized, and I helped them in the same manner, but not as intensively as in Kassel and Marburg and Eschwege and in the first days. Because there I was on a higher level, on a higher headquarter level. But of course we conducted services. Then in Heidelberg I conducted services again, and the services used to be attended by something like 20 soldiers and 100 DPs. The DPs came into our services. Talking about services, one of the largest services that I ever conducted was in the Henschel Works. It was a railroad engine works in Kassel that was out of commission, and a big hall was set up by military government, and there I would say we had, it was on Rosh Hashanah, right, for the high holy days, we were in the Henschel Works in
Rosh
Kassel.
Hashanah of
45. Big service, again, 250 soldiers and 700 DPs. It was, they actually made a head count of slightly over 1,000, but the ratio was a good 1 to 3 in favor of the DPs. And I think we had refreshments afterwards on Rosh Hashanah that I had sort of scurried up from money attached to JWB money, and military government brought in some of the things from the actual kitchens, from the army kitchens. There was a slight repast, nothing to elaborate, but we were able to include the DPs. This also was technically illegal, but nobody cared. We really were feeding the DPs. These are some of the major things I remember. That's about it, I guess.
How would you characterize the role of the chaplains during this period of time?
In what sense? Oh, yeah.
Well, just generally, what was their role during this period of time that you were talking about?
Their role was really to be their government. It was the closest thing they had to anyone in authority that could do anything for them, their behalf. It was definitely, as I mentioned before when I said they wanted us in their camp, it was an emotional experience for them to know that someone cared, someone that wasn't down and out, someone that had a certain amount of influence and authority and had an officer's uniform. And secondly, practically speaking, they had to turn to us. For example, as little thing as they began to try to make contact with relatives and friends in France, in Palestine, in America. There was no postal service in Germany. The only postal service was through the chaplains. There's also where we have suddenly got a thing we shouldn't do that. We suddenly got, one day I had a whole mail sack full of mail which had nothing to do with government. It was all DP mail. So any of their needs, you have to realize that everything was broken down. The only thing in 45 and early 46, the only thing that worked was military government. So their only access to any of the amenities was through the chaplains.
What do you think would have happened without the chaplains?
I think the despair would have been worse than it was. I think we wouldn't have organized them as fast for Aliyah Bet. I think Aliyah Bet would have more difficult. I think more people would actually have starved. More people would have committed suicide. There would have been more internal strife, and more people would have languished in German jails for months and months on end. I would say years, because the crimes were of that nature. But nobody cared really, especially, as I said, after the first 2-3 months, the Gentiles lost interest in the whole thing. At the beginning, the Gentiles were almost as horrified and therefore as willing to help as the Jews. But it's amazing how soon then their interest was in German women and drinking and all that.
What about your involvement with the Jewish Agency? How would you characterize the work of the chaplains and the Jewish Agency?
Well, being in the areas I was, there were only a few moments. At the very beginning, I had a feeling that the Jewish agency was in there. I told you that. I went to Paris to find out what was what, and to report also and say, come in and help us. And the first thing was JDC, and JDC was closed for 3 days. It was business as usual. And I had only a 2-day pass, and I had to get back. Whereas the Jewish agency, they were operating during the night, Shabbos, not Shabbos, and making plans, obviously, for Aliyah, but they didn't even tell me. I first had to identify myself, and they really went through a real procedure of security, and it was practically at that moment, nobody could help me too much. I had to use the resources that were there. But at least you had the feeling that they knew that a job was to be done. And then in a few instances in Kassel, and so brigade people came in.
And how did you help them?
Simply by introducing them into the camp and seeing that they got access. But they knew their way around. They didn't need too much of my help, to be very honest. I mean, I helped directly DPs. One or two, I gave them advice where to go and where the camps were. But having British uniforms, they could go in just as well as I could. They had the same position that the chaplains had.
What about UNRWA?
UNRWA was very, very soon took over from much that we did in plain feeding and housing. But that was primarily only in the camps, and the people who didn't want to be in the camps did not have the full benefit of UNRWA.
So you're still necessary.
For them, I had to get there, yes.
And the JDC, you say, after initial...
After initial being caught with the proverbial pants down, recovered and did a good job. You'll get that from Jimmy Rice. He was there. One of the workers really did a job.
Did you know Jake the plumber?
No.
Okay, because he was in the 7th Army Division. Work within the camps?
Yeah.
Your work within the camps. Is there anything that you would quickly like to tell me?
No, I have to go.
Okay.
There's really nothing particularly in addition to what I said.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.